When the president stepped out of the motorcade at the signing ceremony, the entire hall rose to its feet. Everyone except Rowan Hale, the driver whom CEO Vivian Ashcroft had described to her assistants that morning as an ordinary man who happened to know how to hold a steering wheel. Rowan only adjusted his cuff as if he hadn't noticed the veteran agents watching him with an odd, unmistakable respect. Then the president walked past a room full of billionaires, stopped directly in front of him, extended a hand and said, "Welcome back, Ghost One." The glass in Vivian's hand trembled. The man she had dismissed only hours earlier was suddenly the one person in the room everyone else seemed to fear and admire at once, and she had no idea who he truly was. If you want to know why Ghost One disappeared and who forced him into hiding, tap subscribe now and stay with me as the truth behind Rowan Hale comes out. 3 days before the ceremony, Rowan received a routine dispatch from the private transportation company he contracted with. He would be covering for the regular driver of Ashcroft Meridian's chief executive, who had left suddenly for a family emergency. Rowan arrived early, checked the tires, checked the mirrors, and waited outside the glass tower with the same patience he brought to every job, never once expecting the assignment to matter beyond a paycheck. Vivian came down through the lobby surrounded by 3 assistants, each narrating a different part of her schedule. She barely glanced at him as she slid into the back seat. "Open the door, follow the route, and I don't need your input." Rowan absorbed the instruction without reaction, the way he absorbed most things, filing it away rather than answering it. Before they reached the first intersection, she was already telling an assistant on speakerphone that she didn't need a driver who thought only one who drove and stayed quiet. The words landed in the front seat exactly the way she intended. He didn't flinch, didn't adjust his posture, didn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. And that unsettled something in her she couldn't quite name. He'd taken jobs like this dozens of times over the years, driving executives who barely remembered his name by the end of a contract. He'd long ago stopped expecting anything different. What mattered to him now was simpler than it had ever been, a steady paycheck, health coverage that helped with his daughter Mara's tuition and evenings, quiet enough to call her without static on the line or the sense that someone might be listening. He kept a photograph of Mara tucked in the visor of every car he drove, a small habit. No employer ever noticed a reminder of the promise he'd made in a hospital room 6 years earlier, that Mara would never grow up in the shadow of a father who was never truly present. Vivian had no interest in the private life of a temporary driver. To her, he was another interchangeable piece of the machinery that kept her schedule running, no different from the elevator that carried her to the lobby. On the way to a meeting with federal trade officials, Rowan noticed a silver sedan appear at 3 consecutive intersections, always a few car lengths back, always matching their speed. He said nothing to Vivian. Instead, he rerouted around a construction delay that didn't exist, taking a longer path down a side avenue no ordinary driver would ever have known. "You deviated from the schedule without asking me," Vivian snapped, not looking up from her phone. "I gave you a route." "You did," Rowan said evenly, eyes moving between the road and the mirror. "We'll still be early." "That's not the point. The point is, you decided something without me." He didn't answer. In the mirror, the silver sedan slid 2 lanes over and dropped back, and only then did his shoulders ease, a change so small she never saw it. They arrived 2 minutes ahead of the original estimate. As she stepped out, the silver sedan rolled past the spot where their car would have been parked, empty of whatever confrontation it had been waiting for. Rowan memorized the plate number and tucked it away the way he tucked away everything that might matter later. That evening, Grant Calloway, head of security for Ashcroft Meridian, pulled the day's route logs as a matter of routine and sat back in his chair. The alternate path Rowan had chosen matched almost turn for turn a contingency route once used by federal protective details during periods of elevated threat. A route that was never published or taught to commercial drivers. Grant pulled the new driver's file and found only a handful of lines, a name, a license number, a start date. Nothing that explained where a private hire had learned a maneuver like that. He sat with the thin folder a long time, turning over the same question. Where does an ordinary civilian driver learn to move like that? He requested a deeper background check, and what came back only deepened the mystery. Rowan's record showed several years of military service, but the specifics of his deployments had been sealed under a classification Grant didn't have the clearance to view. After his discharge, Rowan seemed to vanish from every database for nearly 7 years before resurfacing as a licensed civilian driver. When Grant asked him directly, Rowan offered nothing more than a mild answer about having once driven for people who didn't tolerate being late, a phrase that closed the conversation as neatly as it opened it. Meanwhile, Vivian was consumed by the largest deal of her career, a national energy coordination contract between Ashcroft Meridian and the federal government that would determine whether she finally escaped the grip of an aging board or lost her position entirely. If it succeeded, she'd gain enough independent authority to reshape the company on her own terms. If it collapsed, Gideon Wexler held more than enough votes to force her out. Gideon presented himself as her most devoted advisor, a man who had known her family for decades, and who gently reminded her again and again not to let low-level employees influence decisions that belonged only to her. During one drive, Rowan overheard Vivian discussing a classified document referred to only as the Aegis Framework. From the fragments he understood, this wasn't merely an energy initiative, but a system meant to keep hospitals, airports, and government facilities running during a national emergency. When the car stopped outside a hotel for a private meeting, he noticed the seal on Vivian's briefcase had been disturbed so slightly that almost no one would have caught it. "Did the case leave your sight at any point this afternoon?" he asked carefully. "You've overstepped the boundaries of a driver," she said. "Don't involve yourself in matters that have nothing to do with traffic or timing." Rowan didn't argue. He quietly photographed the broken seal on his phone before she noticed. That night, alone in his apartment, he compared it against an old catalog of security markings he still remembered from another life, and found a match: a defunct firm called Wexler Strategic Systems, a company that had officially dissolved years earlier. He stared at the name a long while before setting the phone down, aware that whatever he'd uncovered was only the surface of something much larger. The next evening, Vivian attended a closed reception for investors and government officials. Rowan was told to wait outside with the other drivers, and instruction he followed without complaint. Even from the curb, he studied the building's layout, the flow of catering staff, the placement of cameras, and noticed a service entrance propped open in a way that violated the building's own protocol. He mentioned it to Grant without explaining how he'd spotted it. Grant's team found a card cloning device hidden near the doorway, evidence of an attempt to steal digital access rather than stage any physical confrontation. Grant began cautiously to trust that Rowan might be more useful than his file suggested, though Vivian still treated the discovery as coincidence rather than skill. That same evening, Grant cross-referenced the cloned card against the building's vendor logs, and what he found troubled him more than he let on. The device had been installed using credentials belonging to a maintenance contractor who, according to every record he could access, hadn't worked in the building for over a year. Someone with real institutional knowledge had orchestrated the breach, not an opportunistic outsider. He started a private file of his own, separate from the official reports, cataloging every strange detail since Rowan joined the rotation: the sedan, the broken seal, the propped door, the ghost contractor. He couldn't yet see how they connected, but he was increasingly certain that they did. Inside the reception, Gideon made a point of telling a cluster of investors that Vivian had grown paranoid, that she was taking her cues from a driver instead of her own board. The remark traveled the room quickly enough that Vivian felt the sting before she reached her car. Once the doors closed, she turned that anger on Rowan. Why would an apparently intelligent man settle for a job behind a wheel? "An ordinary job doesn't make an ordinary man," Rowan said. It did nothing to soften her mood. "You're paid to move me from one point to another. Don't turn this into something larger than it is." As Rowan said nothing, letting the silence sit between them for the rest of the ride. Her daughter's number never came up that night. It was Rowan's own phone that rang, his college-age daughter Mara checking in the way she always did. Through the brief exchange, Vivian learned almost by accident that he was a single father who had raised his daughter alone for years. He didn't perform hardship for an audience. He only asked whether she'd eaten, whether she'd finished the studio project she was worried about, and reminded her to check the lock on her door before bed, the same small ritual he'd repeated on nearly every call since she left for school. "Get some sleep," he said at the end. "You did the hard part already." Then he hung up and drove on as if nothing had happened. Vivian, listening from the back seat, was struck by how ordinary the exchange sounded, how little it resembled the transactional check-ins she had with her own family, where every conversation eventually circled back to the company. She thought briefly of her father, a man who had measured his affection in opportunities handed down rather than questions asked, and wondered uncomfortably which version of care actually meant more. It was the first moment she'd looked at Rowan as a person rather than a title, though she wasn't ready to admit it. When he pulled up to her building that night, Rowan noticed an envelope among the mail on her entry table that hadn't been there that morning. Inside was a single old photograph of him in uniform, along with a short handwritten line, "Ghosts should stay buried." He slipped it into his jacket before Vivian could see, understanding now that whoever was behind the surveillance had recognized exactly who he used to be. The situation had changed in ways he could no longer navigate alone. He reached out to Nathan Crow, a former colleague now working in federal security. "Stay out of it," Nathan warned bluntly. "Whatever's unfolding is bigger than one driver can manage." Through their conversation, it became clear that Ghost One had once commanded a covert unit responsible for extracting officials, witnesses, and diplomats from situations that could never be acknowledged publicly. 7 years earlier, that unit had been dissolved after a classified operation was leaked, and Rowan had been quietly blamed for the failure, though no formal evidence ever tied the breach to him. To protect the remaining members of his team from further scrutiny, he'd accepted the blame in silence and walked away from the only career he'd ever known, never learning who had actually betrayed them. "Do you understand what it would mean to step back into that world?" Nathan pressed, "after 7 years of school pickups and grocery runs in quiet apartments." "No," Rowan admitted. "Only that I can't stand by and watch another operation collapse around people who have no idea they're standing inside one." He thought of Elise in the quiet after the call ended, of the years right after her diagnosis when he'd promised himself Mara would never again come second to a mission with no name. He'd kept that promise faithfully, built an entire ordinary life around keeping it. And yet some instinct older than grief told him walking away now wouldn't protect anyone, least of all his daughter. Nathan finally relented and agreed to quietly pull whatever unclassified fragments he could find on Wexler's strategic systems, warning that if Rowan's name resurfaced in any official record, there would be no controlling what happened next. The next morning, Grant discovered that someone with board-level access had altered the motorcade route scheduled for the day of the ceremony, and the login credentials used belonged to a director who had died nearly 2 years earlier. Rowan concluded this wasn't an assassination plot, but something more calculated, an attempt to manufacture an incident large enough to collapse the contract without casualties, since deaths would trigger a federal investigation too thorough for anyone to survive. Vivian overheard part of the conversation between the two men and felt betrayed that they were investigating behind her back. "Tell me plainly who you actually are," she demanded. "I'm someone trying to make sure you make it to tomorrow," Rowan said. "That's not an answer, that's a line." "It's the only answer that matters right now." She heard arrogance rather than reassurance and decided in that moment to terminate his contract the day after the ceremony. And yet, against her will, she began to notice that Rowan had never once asked her for a bonus, a title, or even her trust. Every action he'd taken had been aimed at protecting her and the people around her without any expectation of credit. Gideon walked into the security office and saw Rowan's face displayed on a monitor, and the practiced smile he wore in public vanished instantly. He said the name to himself barely above a whisper. Ghost One. Gideon had spent more than 20 years perfecting the appearance of loyalty, sitting at the head of the Ashcroft family table during holidays, attending Vivian's graduation, standing beside her at her father's funeral. With a hand on her shoulder, the whole room read as grief rather than calculation. In private, he viewed the family fortune as something he'd built as much as any Ashcroft had decades of strategy that had never once come with his name on the letterhead. He'd grown tired of watching a woman half his age inherit authority she had not, in his estimation, earned. The scheme with Wexler Strategic Systems had begun small, a handful of quiet contracts routed through shell companies years earlier. When Rowan's old unit came close to exposing it, Gideon hadn't hesitated to erase his own tracks and let another man's career absorb the damage. He told himself in the years since that this was simply how power worked, that someone always had to be sacrificed to keep the larger structure standing, and he'd never once lost sleep over the name of the man he sacrificed. Now he accelerated the final stage of his plan. He leaked a fabricated technical report to several media contacts claiming the Aegis system carried a catastrophic design flaw and timed its release to strike exactly as the president arrived at the ceremony. His intent was straightforward: force the government to abandon the contract crash. Ashcroft's stock and give the board the justification it needed to remove Vivian for good. He'd already lined up 3 sympathetic votesmen who owed him favors older than Vivian herself, and he was confident that within a week of the ceremony's collapse, he'd be sitting in the chief executive's chair. Rowan traced the silver sedan back to a private security firm, quietly owned by one of Gideon's relatives, and brought the evidence directly to Vivian. "It's not enough to accuse a man who has served my family loyally for more than 2 decades, she said, unwilling to believe someone so close to her was capable of it. Gideon appeared at precisely that moment, and with practiced calm cast doubt on Rowan instead. A man with a sealed file might be exploiting the chaos to gain access to sensitive company secrets, he suggested. Vivian found herself caught between the advisor who had guided her family for 20 years and the driver she'd known for barely 3 days. She chose Gideon. "You're nothing more than an ordinary driver imagining himself important," she told Rowan, and the words hung in the room long after she'd said them. Some part of her recognized even as she spoke that she was leaning on the same instinct her father had taught her since childhood, that authority had to be defended loudly and immediately, or it would be assumed not to exist at all. She pushed the doubt aside and let the anger carry her. Rowan didn't raise his voice or defend himself. He removed his employee badge, set it on the table, and said he'd complete his final scheduled drive as agreed before leaving the company for good. Grant tried to intervene, insisting there was still time to review the evidence. "Vivian has every right to decide who stays close to her," Rowan told him quietly. "Even if the decision is wrong, some things a person has to be allowed to get wrong before they can ever get them right." The ride to the ceremony was colder than any silence they'd shared. Vivian slowly realized Rowan had never once tried to prove her wrong, and what unsettled her most wasn't his silence, but the quiet certainty in it, the sense that he'd been wrongly accused this way before. Just before they arrived, Rowan asked her a single question. "If every title disappeared tomorrow, who would you still trust?" Vivian opened her mouth, then closed it. She thought of the board of Gideon, of the assistants who narrated her schedule, and realized she was counting titles, not people. She had no answer, and the silence told him everything he needed to know. As the motorcade pulled out of the lot, Rowan noticed the license plate on the escort vehicle behind them had been swapped, and the man driving it wasn't one of Ashcroft's regular security staff. His posture was too stiff, his mirrors angled wrong for someone who'd driven the route 100 times. Rowan didn't raise an alarm that would spread panic or give Vivian another reason to doubt him in front of her staff. Instead, he relayed a short coded message to Grant through a frequency the two of them had quietly agreed on days earlier, a habit left over from a career Grant didn't yet fully understand, but had learned to trust. Within seconds, Grant rerouted the lead car onto a different path without alerting the wider detail, keeping the change small enough to look like routine caution ahead of a high-profile event. The imposter vehicle tried to follow, matching the detour, turn for turn, and was intercepted at a checkpoint. Grant activated remotely federal officers closing the road behind them before the driver even realized he'd been identified. The entire threat was neutralized without a single confrontation, resolved instead through precision and timing that only someone with Rowan's training could have executed, the kind of quiet, invisible save that had once defined his whole career and that no headline would ever report. Vivian understood that Rowan had just saved her from a carefully engineered trap, yet she still couldn't comprehend how a hired driver had the authority to order federal checkpoints closed on his word alone. When they reached the conference center, a second problem revealed itself. The server hosting the Aegis presentation had begun uploading a corrupted version of the data meant to make the entire system appear unstable in front of the president and the assembled press. Rowan recognized the method instantly. The same technique used to falsify records and destroy his old unit 7 years earlier, exploiting the identity of someone deceased to alter data, then shifting blame onto whoever happened to be standing closest to the failure. In that instant, he understood with complete certainty that Gideon was the one who had betrayed his old team all those years ago. Gideon had once sold information about government travel routes through Wexler Strategic Systems, and when Rowan discovered the breach, Gideon had erased every trace of his involvement and let Rowan take the fall. Rowan and Grant located the physical server broadcasting the falsified data tucked inside a maintenance closet 3 floors below the main hall, disguised behind a panel meant to look like ordinary infrastructure. Rather than destroy it, Rowan insisted they preserve it intact. A broken machine tells federal prosecutors nothing, he told Grant. An intact one handled properly ties every falsified file back to the hands that built it. Grant photographed the server from every angle, logged the chain of custody the way Rowan instructed, and sealed the room before anyone outside their small circle knew it had been found. Within minutes, a quiet request went out through Nathan Crow's contacts for a federal digital forensics team to stage nearby, ready to move the moment the ceremony concluded, so no piece of evidence would sit unprotected long enough for anyone to tamper with it a second time. Vivian learned the truth from Grant before she ever heard it from Rowan himself, and she finally understood that the man she'd just called ordinary had accepted public humiliation without protest in order to protect her company and everyone in it. Outside, the presidential motorcade arrived, and a senior agent watching the security feed recognized Rowan's face. He spoke quietly into his earpiece before anyone else understood what was happening. "Confirm Ghost 1 is on site." The signing ceremony began in the main hall, filled with officials, investors, and press, all unaware how close the event had come to unraveling minutes earlier. Vivian still had to appear composed while Gideon stood near the board members, confident the falsified data was about to reach every screen in the room. Rowan planned only to finish his final assignment and leave quietly, expecting no recognition and wanting none. Vivian noticed him standing near the exit, but her pride kept her from calling out the weight of her earlier words still sitting between them. President Caleb Whitmore entered the hall, and rather than proceeding directly to the stage as protocol required, he stopped the moment he recognized Rowan among the crowd, before Vivian, before Gideon, before a room full of dignitaries. He crossed the floor and walked straight toward the driver, standing quietly near the door. He extended his hand. "Welcome back, Ghost 1. The room fell completely still. Older agents scattered through the crowd straightened at once, a wordless gesture of respect that needed no explanation. Vivian stood frozen. Gideon's composure cracked for the first time, the realization sinking in that whatever cover he'd built was no longer safe. The president revealed just enough for the room to understand that Rowan had once commanded an elite protective unit and had personally saved numerous lives, including the president's own, though he carefully withheld any classified detail. He described in general terms a night many years earlier when a diplomatic crisis had threatened to spiral into something far more dangerous, and how a small team led by the man now standing before them had extracted him and 2 members of his staff without a single shot fired or a single name leaked to the press. "Rowan didn't vanish because he failed at his duty," Caleb said. "He vanished because he refused to let his team absorb the consequences of a conspiracy far larger than any of them, choosing silence over a defense that would have exposed people who'd trusted him with their lives." He added with quiet emphasis meant for the entire room that some of the most capable people in the country worked without recognition, without titles, without anyone in a room like this ever learning their names, and that the country was better for it, even when it meant men like Rowan carried the cost alone. Vivian stood replaying every moment she'd dismissed him as nothing more than a man behind a wheel, each memory landing with a fresh and specific discomfort, now that she understood what had been sitting in her front seat all along. Rowan didn't linger in the attention. He turned to the president. "Has the technical team verified the current version of the Aegis presentation?" The question pulled the room's focus back to the danger that hadn't fully passed. Gideon tried to slip quietly toward the exit, but federal agents had already secured every door. Rowan looked at him and spoke plainly. 7 years is a long time to wait before making the same mistake twice. The ceremony paused, but was not canceled. Grant and a team of federal technicians traced the compromised server, and the recovered data confirmed that Gideon had funneled company funds through a network of shell corporations, manipulated stock movements, and stolen proprietary technology from Ashcroft Meridian over several years. More damning. Still, the digital signature, embedded in the falsified files, matched the trace left behind during the original leak that had destroyed Rowan's old unit. Gideon's removal was handled quietly without any dramatic confrontation as agents escorted him into a private room behind the stage for questioning. He sat across a narrow table from federal investigators with the same composed expression he'd worn at every board meeting for 20 years, insisting at first that the falsified data must have originated from a disgruntled former employee. When investigators laid out the financial trail linking his relative's security firm to the silver sedan that had trailed Vivian's car for days, his composure thinned only slightly, a flicker at the corner of his mouth that Grant, watching through the glass, recognized as the first real crack in 20 years of careful performance. Even then, Gideon made one final attempt to turn Vivian against Rowan. He only returned seeking revenge, he told her. He used you as bait to settle an old score from a career that ended in disgrace. You trusted me with this company since you were a young woman grieving your father. Does a stranger from 3 days ago truly deserve more loyalty than that? Rowan acknowledged plainly that he hadn't initially known Gideon was involved, that his suspicions only began after he noticed the broken seal on the briefcase. A detail so small that even Gideon, listening, seemed briefly startled. It had been enough to unravel him. Why didn't you just tell me everything from the beginning? Vivian asked, rather than let me stumble through days of doubt. Trust can't be forced through a title or a resume, Rowan said. You needed to decide for yourself whether to follow the evidence or follow whatever felt convenient at the time. In that moment, Vivian understood that her greatest failure had never been underestimating his skill, but believing a person's worth was measured entirely by their position. Gideon was led away in silence without the spectacle she might once have expected. Vivian apologized to Rowan, but not with the vague, generic apology people give when they simply want a conversation to end. She repeated back almost word for word the exact sentence she'd used to dismiss him, admitting openly that it reflected how she'd treated people without power for most of her career. Respect only means something, Rowan told her, when it's given to people who have nothing to offer in return. He accepted the apology, though he made clear he wasn't offering complete forgiveness in that instant. Vivian returned to the stage and faced a decision no one could make for her: continue the signing quietly and protect her reputation, or disclose the incident publicly and risk everything she'd built. She chose honesty. She informed the room of the security breach, accepted responsibility for the gaps in her company's oversight, and agreed to an independent audit before the contract could proceed. Her transparency unsettled the board, but earned something more valuable from the federal government: a renewed trust no amount of polished messaging could have manufactured. The president agreed to move forward on the condition that Ashcroft Meridian overhaul its internal security and permanently sever any remaining ties to Gideon's network. The ceremony resumed and concluded using the original uncorrupted version of the Aegis data exactly as it had been designed. In the aftermath, the president personally offered Rowan a position as a strategic security advisor, a chance to reclaim the career and reputation he'd lost 7 years earlier. Rowan declined the full-time role without hesitation. I've spent too many years living like a ghost, present in my daughter's life only through phone calls. He agreed instead to assist quietly with an investigation aimed at clearing the names of every member of his old unit who'd been unfairly blamed alongside him. Vivian offered him a formal position as head of special security for Ashcroft Meridian, a title with real authority and a salary that would have made most people in her boardroom envious. He turned it down too. Titles have cost me more than they've ever given me. I have no interest in trading one gilded cage for another just because this one comes with better hours. He agreed to serve as an independent advisor on 2 conditions: that Grant remain in operational control day to day, and that every employee from the newest driver to the most senior executive be given a real voice in how risks were reported. So no warning would ever again be dismissed simply because of who happened to raise it. Vivian agreed without argument, and for the first time since her father's death, she found herself restructuring a piece of her company not to protect her own position, but because it was simply the right way to run it. She asked him quietly whether he still considered her someone who couldn't be trusted. "You've begun learning to listen," Rowan said, "before you know how important the person speaking actually is." It wasn't a declaration of anything more, but it was the first sign he was willing to give her the chance to prove it. As he prepared to drive away that evening, Vivian opened the front passenger door instead of the back one she'd always used. "Today, I don't need a driver, she said. "I need someone who'll tell me when I'm heading in the wrong direction." Rowan started the engine. "In that case, you'd better put on your seatbelt." 6 months later, Ashcroft Meridian had stabilized its reputation, slowly rebuilding under new leadership and stricter oversight, while Gideon faced formal charges for fraud, data theft, and obstruction. The trial drew far less attention than the ceremony that had exposed him, largely because Vivian insisted on handling the fallout with restraint rather than spectacle. Rowan's name was formally cleared from every record that had once cast suspicion on him, and the surviving members of his old unit had their reputations restored alongside his, several of them reaching out for the first time in years simply to say thank you. Nathan Crow called once the paperwork was finalized, his voice carrying something close to relief, and told Rowan the entire unit's file had finally been closed with an official notation clearing every one of them. Mara came home from school and met Vivian for the first time at a small diner Rowan had frequented for years, long before any of this happened. Vivian arrived without an assistant, without a security escort, without the packed schedule that had once defined every hour of her day. Rowan introduced her simply as a friend, nothing more elaborate than that, though Mara caught the small, unguarded smile that crossed her father's face when he said the word, a smile she hadn't seen in longer than she could remember. Over coffee, Vivian asked Mara what she was working on this semester and actually listened to the answer about a housing project for displaced families. The kind of attention Mara had rarely received from anyone connected to her father's old professional life. When the conversation drifted toward the ceremony and the president's now famous handshake, Mara admitted she'd watched the footage more times than she wanted to say, still trying to reconcile the composed stranger on the screen with the father who used to fall asleep on the couch after long shifts. Some things about a person take longer than a video to understand, Rowan said with a shrug. Watching the two of them, Vivian thought that was probably the truest thing she'd heard him say since the day they met. As they left the diner, a young employee recognized Rowan from the news and called him Ghost One without thinking. Rowan only smiled and didn't answer to the name. He opened the car door for Mara first, then looked over at Vivian standing beside him. For the first time in years, he was no longer a man living inside his own past or hiding behind the wheel of someone else's car. He was simply Rowan Hale, a father, a man whose name had finally been cleared and someone allowing himself at last to begin again. For years he'd measured his worth by how completely he could vanish from a situation once the job was done, by how few traces he left of ever having been there. It had taken almost losing everything a second time to understand that disappearing was not the same as protecting the people he loved. Vivian settled into the front seat beside him. No briefcase between them this time, no schedule dictating the next hour. Only the quiet, ordinary comfort of two people who had learned in the hardest possible way what it meant to see someone clearly before deciding what they were worth. The car pulled into traffic, past the glass tower where she'd once called him. Nothing more than a man who could hold a wheel out into a city that had no idea how close it had come twice now to losing something it never knew it had. Somewhere behind them, Gideon sat in a cell built from the same silence he'd once used as a weapon. And somewhere ahead, a life neither Rowan nor Vivian had planned for was quietly beginning to take shape. We spend so much of our lives judging people by their titles, their uniforms, the seats they sit in. But the person you overlook today might be the one holding everything together tomorrow. If Rowan's story stayed with you, tell me in the comments about a time someone surprised you after you'd underestimated them, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story.